Welcome to Faith Space Ottawa, a space for all of us to grow closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala together at our own pace. Come as you are to faith as it is.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enable this gathering to be in our scale of good deeds. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward us for the time that we spare, the effort put forth. We ask Allah to enable us to benefit, to exit from this gathering with hearts more steadfast on the path, more loving of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more following of the Prophet alayhi salam. Say Ameen. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Jazakumullah khair for coming tonight, and may Allah reward you and accept from you. We are pondering the seerah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And we specifically chose this title. Why? Because we're not just going through the seerah, through what happened, the events, the incidents. We're also going to reflect and ponder and perhaps deduce lessons really that we can apply in our day-to-day lives, inshallah. So that's the goal from this series. And we always start the series with a section called Why This Series, the intro. And then we'll touch on today's segment, which is the blessed marriage of the Prophet ﷺ. That's pretty much the topic of today. And then we will conclude with some discussion, inshallah. So why this series? This is a very interesting quotation by Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah. He says the following. He says, معرفة سبب النزول يعين على فهم الآية فإن العلم بالسبب يورث العلم بالمسبب. Which translates to that knowing the reason for revelation helps in understanding the verses of the Quran. Why was this verse revealed? Knowing that reason, knowing the context, helps in understanding not just the context, but the meaning of the verse. And he says, knowledge of the cause leads to knowledge of the causer, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he is talking about this in the context of course, it's in this book, Introduction to the Principles of Tafsir, Muqaddimah fi Usul al-Tafsir. That's the book that he writes this in. And it's in the context of talking about the stories of the Quran. And specifically when we study the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, when we study the life of the Prophet ﷺ, we're actually studying the context within which verses of the Quran were revealed. And so this will be a little bit more evident once we, enter or pass the phase of revelation or enter into the phase of revelation. We're still not there yet, but once we're there, you'll feel, subhanAllah, that the verses as they were revealed and what was the context, what was the Prophet doing, what were the Sahaba doing, did they receive the revelation, how did they act upon it, right? So all of that, inshallah, is going to be something that is going to be of benefit. We ask Allah to enable us to get to that point, inshallah. And this is a verse in Surah An-Nisa where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about obedience to Allah and His Messenger. وَمَن يُطَعِ اللَّهَ وَالرَّسُولَ. Whoever obeys Allah and the Messenger, فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمَ عَلَيْهِمْ أَنْعَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ. Ma'a here is ma'iyah, meaning the companionship. They will be in the company of those blessed by Allah. With what? Or like whom? And then Allah says, مِنَ النَّبِيِّينَ وَالصِّدِّيقِينَ وَالشُّهَدَاءِ وَالصَّالِحِينَ. Like the prophets and the people of truth and the martyrs and the righteous. What an honorable companionship. وَحَسُنَ أُولَٰئِكَ رَفِيقًا. And so this is the companionship that we hope to have. This is the people that we hope to gather with and be around and be a part of, right? This is the true Hizbullah, right? The party of Allah, right? Not the ones that kind of use that slogan today, but the true party of Allah, the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the ones that are amongst the righteous, amongst the pious, amongst those that are truthful, amongst shuhada, right? As we see many of the shuhada in Gaza and many of the shuhada all around the world actually, right? These are all in that same companionship, and so we hope to be with them by obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet alayhi salam. So studying the seerah is part of this, right? It's all part of this. All right, so that was just an intro. Like every time we kind of have a brief segment about the intro and why the series. Let's touch upon today's segment, inshallah. And before we do that, before we go into the marriage of the Prophet ﷺ with Khadija radiallahu anha, we'll do so in a little bit more detail. We have this very interesting hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari. In Sahih al-Bukhari, the narrator of this hadith is actually Ibn Umar. So his name is Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma. They actually, so not Umar, but the son of Umar, says the following. He says, ربما ذكرت قول الشاعر وأنا أنظر إلى وجه النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يستسقي فما ينزل حتى يجيش كل ميزاب. That translates to the following poetic verse occurred to my mind while I was looking at the face of the Prophet ﷺ while he was praying for rain. So this is called Salatul Istisqa. It is a special type of salah seeking rain. So there was a drought that hit Al-Medina, and there was days upon days that passed without any rain. And so the Prophet ﷺ rose up on the minbar and he made a special dua, special supplication, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for rain. And so this Sahabi, Abdullah ibn Umar, who was actually young at the time, he says, I would look at the Prophet's face and I remembered a line of poetry. And the line of poetry is, وَأَبْيَضَ يُسْتَسْقَى الْغَمَامُ بِوَجْهِهِ ثِمَالُ الْيَتَامَ عِصْمَةٌ لِلْأَرَامِلِ. And then he says, in the hadith, وَهُوَ قَوْلُ أَبِي طَالِبٍ. So this line of poetry is actually a line of poetry written by Abu Talib. Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, not the grandfather, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. Translates to, and a white person who is requested to pray for rain and who takes care of the orphans and is the guardian of widows. Abu Talib wrote a line of poetry, some scholars call it Lamiyat Abi Talib, which is like a set of rhythmical sentences of Abu Talib. And there are around 80 or so verses, and he said them, he didn't write them, he said them, and then they were recorded later on, but he said them when the Prophet was attacked viciously. So after Islam was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and the disbelievers of Mecca started to attack the Prophet ﷺ and say insane things about him, Abu Talib rose to defend the Prophet. And he rose to defend the Prophet with lines of poetry praising the Prophet ﷺ, even though Abu Talib himself was not Muslim. But he was praising the Prophet ﷺ. And amongst the things that he said was this, that Abdullah ibn Umar remembered at the time of Salatul Istisqa many years later in Medina, when Abu Talib had passed away, when they had migrated to Medina, right? And so it's interesting because some scholars say that this is proof that Istisqa happened with Abu Talib and the Prophet ﷺ in Mecca, right? What does that mean? That there was a time where the people of Mecca, they sought, rain, and they asked Allah for rain, and the Prophet was with them. And this is referring to it. This is why Abu Talib uses that phrase. He says, يُسْتَسْقَى الْغَمَامُ بِوَجْهِهِ, right? Requested to pray for rain. And so that is a very interesting segment. There is a small kind of narration narrated in some kind of secondary books of Seerah, that not Ibn Hisham, it's not there. It's in other books of Seerah that are very kind of secondary. They're not very authentic. They're very weak in their authenticity. But they say that when the Prophet was very young, Abu Talib, the uncle of the Prophet, and the Prophet himself went out, and they kind of went to the Kaaba, and they kind of touched the Kaaba. Their backs were to the Kaaba actually, and they would ask Allah for rain. It was when Mecca had went through some kind of drought, some kind of lack of rain for some time, and they did this. But other scholars say no, that didn't really happen. Like it's very weak. It's not authentic. We don't have true kind of authentic sources about that. But Istisqa happened in Medina for sure, and this is in Sahih Bukhari that it happened, right? But the lines of poetry do give an indication that perhaps it happened before Islam as well. Now, why is this relevant to us, or why is it relevant to us? It's relevant to us because the Prophet ﷺ is perceived, right, as alayhi salam, as a source of blessings, right? He's perceived as a source of blessings, and the whole lines of poetry that Abu Talib kind of puts forth praising the Prophet ﷺ, he praises the Prophet as such, and he reminds the people of Mecca that this person that you are now attacking viciously, he was a source of blessings for us in many shapes and forms. And here he just listed, one, the prayer towards Istisqa to get rain, and the fact that he, alayhi salam, took care of orphans and took care of widows, right? That was the attribute of the Prophet even before Islam, alayhi salam, and we'll see examples of that later on, inshallah. All right, so it's just an interesting tidbit because there is, like I said, a narration, like if you come across it, did Istisqa happen before revelation? There is, reference to it that it happened in Mecca before the migration of the Prophet ﷺ, before Islam. Now we'll touch upon the job of the Prophet ﷺ, another job. Now we touched upon how he was a shepherd. That was last time. And now it's another job that he had, alayhi salam, as a merchant. And so here is a quotation quoted in Al-Waqidi. Now it's not quoted in Ibn Hisham or Ibn Ishaq. And if you remember, we mentioned that Sirat Ibn Ishaq was perhaps the first book of Seerah ever written. We don't have it. It's lost. We only have quotations from it in the book of Ibn Hisham. Ibn Hisham is a book that we do have, and we have like the authentic, kind of references to it, and it quotes Ibn Ishaq tremendously. In Ibn Ishaq or Ibn Hisham, or remnants of Ibn Ishaq that we have, and Ibn Hisham that we do have, there is no reference to this quotation, that Abu Talib said this, okay? But in a book written by Al-Waqidi, who a lot of people criticize, right? So he is criticized for not being very, kind of correct in his quotations, in his references and whatnot. But I wanted to bring it to you just so that it kind of brings things into context a little bit. If Abu Talib said this, then that's fine. If he did not say it, then it's also fine, but it does give us an idea of what happened. Why did Abu Talib take the Prophet as a merchant and go out into caravans and seek him to become a merchant again? And we know, last time we touched upon the incident that the Prophet had with Bahira the monk, right? So Bahira the monk advised Abu Talib and said, take him back to Mecca. Don't bring him out because he has signs of prophethood and I fear for him from the Jews, right? I'm worried about his life, that he would be affected or be, attacked. And so take him and shelter him until he grows strong and keep him there in Mecca. So here he says, oh, my nephew, I'm a man without money. And that also gives us an idea of Abu Talib's financial situation. And times have become difficult for us, and strange years have befallen us. We have no income or trade. And the caravan of your people is about to set out for Syria. So apparently Mecca is preparing a large caravan that is about to set up, or set out to go to Syria. And Khadija bint Khuwaylid is sending men from your people with her caravans to trade for her and gain profits. So notice Khadija is not going out herself, but she's sending men that she's hiring, right, to pretty much trade on her behalf. And he says, Abu Talib, to his nephew, Muhammad alayhi salam, if you went to her and offered yourself to her, she would hasten to you and prefer you over others because of what she hears of your purity. Right? The reputation of the Prophet ﷺ is now resounding in Mecca, that he's a man of integrity, that he's al-Amin. And he would say, he continues to say, I would hate for you to come to Syria. It means I don't like this. I don't like that this is happening. I don't want you to go to Syria. And I fear for you from the Jews. But we see no alternative to this. There's no alternative. We have to make it happen. Financial times, our finances right now, we're going through hard times. So please go out and do this and make it happen. Now, I mention this because we all know that Khadija hired the Prophet ﷺ, but there's a bit of questions like, okay, how did that hiring process happen, right? And so let's see. And so here is another quotation also by Al-Waqidi. Remember I said take Al-Waqidi with a grain of salt, okay? So it's not very authentic. But here is now Khadija saying, what I have heard of your speech, the greatness of your trustworthiness, and the nobility of your character has called me to send to you. So Khadija is the one that reaches out to the Prophet ﷺ. And she says to him, I'll give you twice what I give to a man of your people. She offered to pay him twice as much as she would another person. Why? Because she trusts his trustworthiness and the nobility of his character, because, like I said, he had that reputation at that point. In a more authentic narration, this is in a book called The Light of Certainty in the biography of the Master of Messengers. So, Nurul Yaqeen fi Hadi Sayyid al-Mursaleen. And by Muhammad al-Khudari, he says, when the Prophet reached the age of 25, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he traveled to the Levant for the second time. He went to Asham for the second time. The first time was that trip when they met the monk Bahir. This is the second time. And he says this was because Khadija bint Khuwaylid was a merchant woman of honor and wealth, and she used to hire men with her wealth and compete with them for it. When she heard about the masters here being the Prophet ﷺ, trustworthiness and honesty in speech, which she had not known in anyone else, so much so that his people called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy one, she hired him to go to the Levant with her wealth as a merchant, and she gave him better than she gave anyone else. He traveled with her servant, Maysara, and they bought and sold and made a great profit. Blessings appeared to the noble master on this journey, which endeared him to Maysara, Khadija's servant. So basically this is, like I said, the more authentic narration, and it is collaborated by Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, that the Prophet ﷺ, he goes, and this is the second trip for him, the first one being when he was with his uncle Abu Talib when he was very young. This is the second one with him, and he's around 25, and he goes to the Levant with the merchandise of Khadija, and he has a servant of Khadija named Maysara who accompanies him, and Maysara witnesses many blessings with the Prophet ﷺ. This is all before prophethood, that endears him to Maysara. Maysara, of course, comes back and reports all this to Khadija. Yes?
Was there a religion practiced in the Levant during that time?
Good question. So mostly, the Levant was kind of ruled over by the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, right? So Christianity Judaism, people were Jewish, people were Christian, people were all faiths at the time existed in the time. It wasn't a specific main one, no. But mostly, I think mostly that region was mostly Christian, but it was not necessarily like everybody was like that. Right? But good question. All right. And so here is Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, in another book of his called The Correct Answer to Those Who Changed the Religion of Christ, لمن بدل دين المسيح, الجواب الصحيح لمن بدل دين المسيح, that's the title of the book. He says, لما شهد عند عمر بن الخطاب رجل فزكاه آخر قال هل أنت جاره. And this is, I'm quoting this, by the way, story of Umar ibn al-Khattab for a reason. I'll give you the translation in a second. The reason is because why did the Prophet have to work as a merchant? Right? And this is a question that we have to ask ourselves all the time. Like, what did it build in the character of the Prophet? What did it change in the Prophet? How did it develop him or help in his development to be ready to receive the message of prophethood? And so here is a very famous story where Umar ibn al-Khattab was there, he was the Amir al-Mu'minin, he was the leader of the believers, and another person was praised in his presence. And so he asked the person that praised him, he says, هل أنت جاره? Are you his neighbor? That you would know, مساءه وصباحه, you would know what his day is like and what his evening is like? He said, no, I'm not his neighbor. He says, هل عملته في الدرهم والدينار? And then he says, الذين تمتحن بهما أمانات الناس? Did you deal with this person when it came to dollars and cents, within or with which the honesty and integrity of people is put to the test? He said, no, I did not deal with him when it came to dollar and cents. هل رافقته في السفر? Did you travel with him on a journey? الذي ينكشف فيه أخلاق الناس? On a journey, the true ethics of a person becomes apparent. He said, no. So he says to him, فلست تعرفه. That means you don't know him. You praised him, you said you know him, but the truth is you're not his neighbor. You did not deal with him when it came to money, when it came to dollar and cents. You did not travel with that person, so you don't really know him. And in another narration, Ibn Taymiyyah quotes, he says that he was also reported to have said, أنه قال لعلك رأيته يركع ركعات في المسجد. Perhaps you saw him make some rak'at in the masjid. You saw him in the masjid praying. And that's how you know him, right? And then Ibn Taymiyyah comments, he says, وذلك أن المنافق قد يظهر الصلاة. So the munafiq, the hypocrite, can show that he's praying, right? فمن لم يخبره, but whoever doesn't experience being with that person, لا يعرف باطن أمره, will not know the inner workings of themselves. So this is kind of the translation, loosely. So a man testified before Ibn al-Khattab, he says, are you his closest neighbor who knows his evening and morning? No. Did you deal with him when it came to dirham and dinar? No. Did you travel with the person? No. That means you don't really know him. And perhaps you saw him praying in the mosque, right? And he says this is because a hypocrite can show that he's praying, but unless you really have some experience with him, that you don't really know him, right? Why do I bring this up? Because being a merchant is dealing with people when it comes to dollars and cents, right? And so the Prophet experiences the true essence of people. But also, it's very important to kind of recognize in this story of ours, the story of the marriage of Khadija to the Prophet ﷺ, what is it that she recognized in him, right? And what is it that she experienced of him? And how did she come to the decision that this is the right man for her, right? In another hadith, the Prophet is reported to have said in Sahih al-Bukhari, he says, رَحِمَ اللَّهُ رَجُلًا سَمْحًا إِذَا بَاعَ وَإِذَا اشْتَرَى وَإِذَا اقْتَضَى. And so may Allah's mercy be upon the one that is lenient in his buying, in his selling, and in his demanding back of his money. The Prophet is praising certain etiquettes and certain, characteristics when it comes to being a merchant, ﷺ, is doing this. And so it shows what type of merchant he was and the characteristics that he praises and recognizes as good characteristics. We also have a very powerful verse in the Quran that talks about dealing in each other's wealth. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل إلا أن تكون تجارة عن تراض منكم. O believers, do not buy or devour one another's wealth illegally, بالباطل, but rather trade by mutual consent. And this is very important because that basically means abuse of power, abuse of wealth, abuse, right, is بالباطل. It's not accepted. It's falsehood, right? It is illegal to do so. But when both sides agree to an exchange of merchandise, of goods, of money, of what have you, then that is what is accepted and that is what is permitted in Islam. So tijara, meaning trade and merchandise and trading merchandise and trading goods, is fine. Buying and selling is fine as long as both parties are agreeing to it. All right, an taradin means that they're both consenting and both accepting of it. So let's continue on with our story. Ibn Hisham narrates, he says, فَنَزَلَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وسلم في ظل شجرة قريبا من صومعة راهب من الرهبان. So now this is the second journey of the Prophet ﷺ, where? To the Levant, to Syria. And there, the Prophet ﷺ rests under a tree. And that tree, by the way, some say that it's actually in Jordan, and some people, kind of say this is the tree, and they point to a specific tree, but Allah Alam. But the point is, it is recorded in Sirat ibn Hisham, he says that there was a tree and it was near a monastery that belonged to a monk, or a monk used to live there. فَأَطْلَعَ الرَّاهِبُ إِلَى مَيْسَرَةٍ. So the rahib, the monk, went to Maysara, and he said to him, who's the man who's sitting under that tree? مَنْ هَذَا الرَّجُلُ الَّذِي نَزَلَ تَحْتَ هَذِهِ الشَّجْرَةِ. So Maysara said, it is a man from Quraysh, min أهل الحرم, from the people of the sanctuary. So Ar-Rahib, the monk, says to Maysara, remember Maysara is the servant of Khadija radiallahu anha. فقال له الراهب, the rahib says, the monk says, ما نزل تحت هذه الشجرة قط إلا نبي. Nobody has ever rested under this tree except a prophet. Except a prophet. All right, so Maysara is kind of influenced now by the monk. Of course, he reports all this back to Khadija. And here is Al-Waqidi reporting on the same narration, but a little bit more details. And remember, Al-Waqidi with a grain of salt, but the detail is that the monk said, is there redness in his eyes? So he's asking Maysara, is there redness in the eyes of Muhammad ﷺ? And Maysara says, yes, it never leaves him. The monk says, this is him, and he is the last of the prophets, and I wish I could see him when he is ordered to go out. To go out meaning to come out as a prophet. And so another kind of interesting narration in Sahih Bukhari refers to this redness in the eyes. And it says, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ضليع الفم أشكل العين منهوس العقبين. So describing the Prophet ﷺ, Jabir ibn Samura, he describes the Prophet and he says the Prophet had a broad face with reddish wide eyes and lean heels. Right, so this is a description of the Prophet ﷺ. So this reddish eyes is reported by Al-Waqidi to have been one of the descriptions of prophethood that the monk, by the way, some say his name is Nastura, that Nastura recognized this reddishness of the eyes as being one of the characteristics of prophethood, and so he asks about it. Does Muhammad have reddishness of the eyes, the one that's sitting under that tree, the tree under which only prophets sit? And then Maysara says, yes, he does have that reddishness in his eyes. Yes?
What does he mean by lean heels?
That's a good question. So that's what it says. And I think the description means that it's not, his heels are not big. Some people have, big heels that you can kind of see, like big feet, big heels. I think it means that it wasn't that big. I think that's how the Prophet is described. But good question. All right, so Ashkal al-Ain is one of the descriptions of the Prophet. All right. And here's another incident that happened. Also, Al-Waqidi reports this, right? And the reason why I'm referring to, like I said, references that you should take with a grain of salt is because we don't have a lot of authentic sources when it comes to prior to Islam, right? Prior to Islam, the recording was very little. What is recorded is not as much as detailed as after Islam. Once, revelation hits, people start recording abundantly, subhanAllah, right? So that's why sometimes you find just one sentence maybe mentioned in, Ar-Rahiq al-Makhtum, for example, the sealed nectar, maybe mentions one sentence, right? So this second monk, Nastura, is not mentioned at all in Ar-Rahiq al-Makhtum. Like the only Bahira is mentioned, the monk Bahira, but this second one is not mentioned at all. So, how authentic it is, like I said, take it with a grain of salt, but there is, like I showed you in the previous reference, right? Where is it? That Maysara actually witnessed blessings, right? Here. So, and made great prophet. Blessings appeared to the noble master on this journey, which endeared him to Maysara. So Maysara reports very positively to Khadija. What is it that Maysara actually saw, right? What are the blessings that he saw? These are some of them, right? These are some of them. There are a few others, by the way, I did not mention. Decided to just skip them because they are a little bit, not even in Al-Waqidi reports them, like other references that are even less authentic than Al-Waqidi. So I said, okay, no, that's too much. I'm not going to go that deep. So where are we? We are after this one, here. Now, here we are. All right. So some difference of opinion happened between the Prophet ﷺ and a person while they were selling, right? So this is in the Levant. كان بينه وبين الرجل اختلاف في السلعة. So the man said, swear by Allati wal Uzza, right? Make an oath in the name of Allat wal Uzza, two idols that exist in Mecca. فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, so the Prophet said, ما حلفت بهما قط, I never made an oath in the name of these idols. وإني لأمر بهما فأعرض عنهما. Whenever I pass by them, I actually avoid them. Right? So this is the Prophet. He says, I turn away from them, talking about the idols of Mecca. And so here, this man then, he says, okay, al-qawlu qawluk. Okay, so he ceded the disagreement. He said, okay, you don't have to make an oath by the name of the idols. We'll go with whatever you say. Then he turns to Maysara, وَخَلَى بِهِ. So he spoke to Maysara alone, and he said, Ya Maysara, هَذَا نَبِي. This is a messenger. وَالَّذِي نَفْسِي بِيَدِهِ إِنَّهُ لَهُوَ هُوَ. By Allah, in whose hands is my soul, he is the one. And our rabbis find him mentioned in their books. وَيَجِدْهُ أَحْبَارُنَا مَنْعُوتًا فِي كُتُبِهِمْ. Now, of course, the word rabbis is not the best translation. It's Google Translate. But ahbar means priests in general. Now, Christian priests, Jewish priests, we don't know, right? Not necessarily Jewish priests. So don't take rabbis with a grain of salt. It's not the best translation. Was this person Jewish? We don't know. It doesn't say. The narration doesn't say. All right, so, but this is an interesting point that highlights something, that the Prophet ﷺ is not doing whatever the customer wants, right? Because that's sometimes you want to sell an item, make an oath in the name of Allah to Allah. Okay, but Allah to Allah, sure, right? No problem. Like, who cares? I care more about selling the item, right? And you find people in the Muslim world today, they will make an oath, Wallahi, this is the best product ever you will have. This is the best, there's no dates better than this. Wallahi al-azim, the best date ever you could ever have, right? Or the best, right? You find people doing this. And they're not really truthful. They're just saying this. Why? Because they want to sell. Because money is the most important commodity, unfortunately, right? So they would sell their soul for the money, unfortunately. So here the Prophet says, no, I do not make an oath in the name. I never did. I never will. And I pass by them and I avoid them entirely. I turn away from them. Yes?
How did all these people know before the Prophet said that this was like the Prophet?
Excellent question. Very good question. And it comes all to the fact that these are different descriptions given about the Prophet ﷺ in the previous scriptures, right? So the rabbis, the Jews, the Christians, they're the ones that are familiar with the Prophet ﷺ. They're the ones kind of looking forward to a messenger coming. The messenger of the end of times is coming out soon. He'll be revealed too soon, right? That's why the Jews of Medina, for example, they would tell the disbelievers of Medina, the idol worshippers of Medina, that very soon a prophet will come, a messenger will come, and we will follow them. We will follow the messenger. And they thought that the messenger will come from within them, from amongst them, right? And so we'll come to that later as well, but basically it comes down to the scriptures and the descriptions. That's why they point out these descriptions, right? In the story of Salman al-Farisi, for example, Salman came from Persia. He met with different priests. He stayed with them, and one of them told Salman about the description of the Prophet ﷺ. And he gave him certain signs. Where did he get these signs? From the Injil, from the books of Revelation that they have, what was left of it, right? The remnants of it. Some of the signs are, for example, this messenger will accept a gift, but will not accept charity. And this messenger has on his back a sign, a symbol, a part of his skin that's called the seal of Prophet. Khatim al-Nubuwwah will be on his back, right? And so Salman wanted those three signs to be met, right? In the story of Salman, we'll touch upon later, inshallah. But basically, those three things, he wanted them to make sure that they were there with the Prophet ﷺ before believing in him. And so, yes, good question. So this is another interesting example of, like I said, the stories that happened in that second journey to Syria. And here, Ibn Hisham narrates, and Ibn Hisham is, he doesn't give a lot of details, right? He says, the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, sold the goods he had brought out and bought what he wanted to buy. Then he set out on his way back to Mecca with Maysara. Maysara, here, as they claim, right? So there's a claim about Maysara. There's no like chain of narrations that, this person said this person said that, right? It's just this general claim, right? That when it was midday and the heat was intense, he would see two angels shading the Prophet, from the sun while he was walking on his camel. When he returned to Mecca with Khadija's money, she sold what he had brought and it doubled or nearly doubled. In profit, that is. So this is another example of the blessings and the miracles that happened with the Prophet ﷺ on this journey. All right, now we come to all of this being reported to Khadija radiallahu anha. Now Khadija has a lot of information about Muhammad ﷺ, right? And it's this moment of truth, so to speak. So here is a narration that you may find online, and it's available, but it's actually very weak. Okay? Very weak. Very weak because it does not exist in Ibn Hisham, it does not exist even in Al-Waqidi, it does not exist anywhere. The one that reports it is a modern day historian named Muhammad Abdu Yamani, who's still alive. And he wrote a book called Khadija bint Khuwaylid, A Lady in the Heart of the Chosen One. Sayyidatu Qalbi al-Mustafa. Right? So that's the title of the book. And he says, the author, that Khadija said this to Nafisa, a friend of hers. Right? So Khadija says, Ya Nafisa, إني أرى في محمد بن عبد الله ما لا أراه في غيره من الرجال. O Nafisa, I see in Muhammad ibn Abdullah what I don't see in any other man. Right? He is the truthful, trustworthy, الصادق الأمين, الشريف الحسيب, noble lineage, وهو الشهم الكريم, chivalrous, generous. These are the characteristics that she describes of the Prophet ﷺ. And then she says, وهو إلى ذلك له, and in addition to that, له نبأ عجيب وشأن غريب. He has a wondrous story and a strange affair. وقد سمعت ما قاله غلامي ميسرة عنه. And I've heard what Maysara said to me about the journey that he had with him. وَرَأَيْتُ مَا كَانَ يُضَلِّلُهُ حِينَ قَدِمَ عَلَيْنَا مِنْ سَفَرِهِ. And I even saw with my own eyes what was shading the Prophet ﷺ on his journey. And so in what he came to us from his journey. And what the monks spoke about him. Right? وَمَا تَحَدَّثَ بِهِ الرُّهْبَانُ عَنْهُ وَإِنَّ فُؤَادِي لَيَكَادُ يَجْزِمُ أَنَّهُ نَبِيُّ هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ. So this is, my heart almost believes that he is the prophet of this nation. So this is Khadija speaking to Nafisa. Right? Now take it with a grain of salt, but it's an interesting quote, a beautiful one, and it highlights what she noticed in the Prophet ﷺ. Right? She didn't notice 666, right? She didn't notice that he's 6 foot, that he makes 6 figures, that he has the 6 abs. She didn't notice any of that, right? That's not what she noticed, right? So what did she notice in the Prophet ﷺ? She noticed characteristics of trustworthiness, of truthfulness, of integrity, noble lineage, chivalrous, right? This is what she noticed in the Prophet ﷺ. All right. So in Ibn Sa'd, by the way, in a book called At-Tabaqat al-Kubra, the major classes, the book of major classes by Ibn Sa'd, he quotes this. And it is basically Nafisa now speaking. She says, فَأَرْسَلَتْنِي دَسِيسًا إِلَى مُحَمَّدٍ. So Nafisa says that Khadija sent me secretly to Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Right? And I said, O Muhammad, what prevents you from getting married? He said, I have nothing to marry with. I don't have wealth, I don't have a home of my own, I'm living with Abu Talib. So she says, what if you're spared all of that and are invited to wealth, beauty, honor, and competence? Will you not respond? And he said, who is she? Who's this woman that has all this and doesn't need anything from me? Khadija. And then he says, how can I do that? You know, so in the وَكَيْفَ لِي بِذَلِكَ, right? وَكَيْفَ لِي بِذَلِكَ, meaning how can I attain that? How can I, get married to Khadija? So she says, علي, leave it to me, right? And he says, then I will do it, right? And so Nafisa says, so I went and told her. She went and told Khadija. Now this narration is more authentic than the previous one where Khadija is praising the Prophet to Nafisa, but it shows that obviously Nafisa was kind of the go-between messenger between Khadija and the Prophet ﷺ. And Nafisa does not, immediately say, how can I do that? In response to that question, she didn't say, don't worry, I was just with her the other day and she said this and this about you, right? And she's already ready. She's just waiting for you to propose, bro. Like, just make it happen, right? So, no, it wasn't like that. Nafisa did not spill the beans, so to speak. Why? Why did she not do that? Because she wanted to retain the honor of Khadija radiallahu anha. And so, the marriage actually happens. In Ibn Hisham, very kind of high level, when Maysara told her what he had told her, she sent for the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, and she said to him directly. So Ibn Hisham actually quotes a quotation of Khadija where she spoke to the Prophet ﷺ, and she said to him, يَا ابْنَ عَمْ إِنِّي قَدْ رَغِبْتُ فِيكَ لِقَرَابَتِكَ وَصِيْتُتُكَ فِي قَوْمِكَ, meaning your reputation and your position in your people. وَأَمَانَتَكَ, and your honesty and trustworthiness. وَحُسْنَ خُلُقِكَ, and your good character. وَصِدْقَ حَدِيثِكَ, your truthfulness. Right? ثُمَّ عَرَضَتْ عَلَيْهِ نَفْسَهَا. So Ibn Hisham says, she's the one that proposed. There was no go-between. So both Both narrations exist, both are there. Scholars say the first one is more authentic, and Nafisa was go-between, but both are there. And so basically, she's the one that proposed. And again, she doesn't say, because you're 6 foot, because you're this, because you're so handsome, because no. She's talking about his characteristics, his trustworthiness, his good character, his truthfulness. That's what she points out. All right. So this is in Muhammad al-Khudri's The Light of Certainty, Nur al-Yaqeen fi Hadi Sayyid al-Mursaleen. This is a speech by Abu Talib. Now Abu Talib takes his nephew Muhammad al-Islam. They go to the house of Khadija. Abu Talib proposes, asks for Khadija basically to be wedded to his nephew. And he says this. He says, praise be to Allah who made us from the descendants of Ibrahim, the seed of Ismail, the children of Ma'ad and the elements of Mudar, and made us the guardians of his house and the keepers of his sanctuary, and made it for us a house of pilgrimage and a secure sanctuary, and made us the rulers of the people. Then this nephew, that was kind of the intro, then this nephew of mine, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, is not to be compared to any man in honor, nobility and virtue, even if he has little money. So even Abu Talib recognizes that the Prophet is poor. And so he says, for money is a passing shadow, a perishable matter, and a loan that must be returned. And by Allah, after this, he has great news and a great matter, and he has proposed to you, desiring your noble Khadija, and he has offered her a dowry. And so this is a speech given by Abu Talib. It was responded to by a speech by the family of Khadija. And in that case, it was not her father. He had passed away earlier. It was actually her uncle. And he basically said, I accept your proposal in the marriage of Khadija to Muhammad ibn Abdullah. What was the dowry, by the way? Ibn Hisham quotes the following, right? So in Sirat Ibn Hisham, he says, the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, gave her a dowry of 20 young camels. 20 young camels, right? So that was the dowry of the Prophet ﷺ that he offered to Khadija. She was the first woman that the Messenger, may Allah be pleased with him, ﷺ, married, and he did not marry anyone else until she died. May Allah be pleased with her. Radiallahu anha. So this was in Sirat Ibn Hisham. This is the dowry that is recorded in Sirat Ibn Hisham. What was the dowry that the Prophet offered? 20 young camels. That's a lot of money. There's no detail as in where did he get it from? Where was it Abu Talib? Abu Talib just mentioned earlier that he was poor. They did not have the money, so where did he get the dowry from? There's no mention of that, right? But here is a hadith in Sahih Muslim where Abi Salama ibn Abd al-Rahman قال سألت عائشة. I asked Aisha. So it shows, how, by the way, Abi Salama here most probably is Ibn Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf. So he is a tabi'i. So this is years after the Prophet passed away, right? The Sahaba, the tabi'een, they would come to Aisha radiallahu anha, they would speak to her from behind a curtain, and they would ask her questions about the Prophet. So he asks Aisha, Aisha lived for a long time after the Prophet. He said, I asked Aisha, the wife of Allah's Messenger, what is the amount of dowry that Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam would pay? She said it was 12 uqliyas and 1 nash, or nash'a, right? Wa nashan, there we go. And then she asks him, Atadri man nashu? Do you know what the nash is? He says, no. She says, it is nisfu uqiyah. فَتِلْكَ 500 دِرْهَمٍ فَهَذَا صَدَاقُ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ لِأَزْوَاجِهِ. So basically the 12 uqiyas and the half, 12 and a half, comes to 500 dirhams, and that was the dowry given by Allah's Messenger to his wives. Some scholars try to, kind of reconcile the two, and they say that the dowry of Khadija was before Islam. It was the 20 young camels. The dowry of the other wives of the Prophet was after Islam. It was always 500 dirhams, right? And so that is, and then scholars differ. 500 dirhams here, what is that exactly? Is it gold or is it silver? Okay? So if it's gold, it's a large amount. So most scholars say it was not gold, it was silver. And 500 dirhams of silver today comes to around $2,000 or so. Okay, so that was the dowry that the Prophet paid to his wives. And some scholars say it was what he paid to Khadija, or it was 20 young camels. We're not sure exactly, but basically it was that. There's also very interesting, it was just an opinion, right, that the dowry of the Prophet to Khadija was not paid up front. Okay, it was not paid up front. Now, where do we get this from? Because in this speech, there's another variation of it, another variation of it that says عاجله وآجله. Right? So that means what? That means the dowry in its entirety, the given upfront and the deferred. Right? So the given upfront and the deferred, that's the dowry. And so they say that basically the dowry that the Prophet gave to Khadija radiallahu anha, it was deferred. He did not give it all at once, he paid it over time. Some of you are asking, why are we talking about this? Are you? Anybody asking why we're talking about this? So at the end we'll touch upon why we're talking about this, inshallah. All right, so we reached here and we want to conclude with just a little bit, information about Khadija. Like, who is Khadija? What do we know about her? Radiallahu anha. So we know this. This is in Tabaqat ibn Sa'd or Tabaqat al-Kubra. He says, كانت خديجة بنت خويلد امرأة حازمة. She was firm. جلدة, meaning strong. شريفة, honorable. مع ما أراد الله بها من الكرامة والخير. With all the honor and goodness that Allah wanted for her. وهي يومئذ, at the time of the marriage that she had with the Prophet ﷺ, أوسط قريش نسبا, meaning she was the most noble of the Quraysh in lineage. وأعظمهم شرفا, the most honorable of them in honor. وأكثرهم مالا, she had the most wealth. وكل قومها, and all her people, كان حريصا على نكاحها, they all wanted to marry her, they were eager to marry her if they were able to do so. Right? قد طلبوها وبذلوا لها الأموال. They actually tried, they proposed. She was getting proposals left, right and center, but she was refusing all of those, and then she herself proposed to the Prophet ﷺ. In Seerah ibn Hisham, Khadija is described by وكانت خديجة امرأة حازمة شريفة لبيبة, firm, honorable and intelligent. In addition to the honor Allah intended for her, at the time Khadija was the most noble of the women of Quraysh in lineage, the most honorable of them, and the richest of them. All her people were eager for her if they could have the ability to do so. Again, she was a sought after woman. And how old was she? Right? So there's a very small minor difference of opinion about her age. Right? Some say 35, some say 28. But this is the most authentic one. It's in Tabaqat ibn Sa'd. In Seerah ibn Hisham, there's no mention of her age. In Tabaqat ibn Sa'd, he says that, and he quotes basically a chain of narration that reaches to Hakim ibn Huzam. Hakim ibn Huzam is actually the cousin of Khadija. Right? So he says, Hakim ibn Huzam, he says, تزوج رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم خديجة وهي ابنة 40 سنة. She was 40 years old. ورسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام ابن 25 سنة. He was 25. وكانت خديجة أسن مني بسنتين. Khadija was older than me, he says, by 2 years. Right? ولدت قبل الفيل ب15 سنة. She was born before عام الفيل, the year of the elephant, by 15 years. So Prophet was born on the year of the elephant, so that makes him 25. And she was born 15 years prior. وولدت أنا, he's talking about himself, Hakim ibn Hizam, I was born 13 years before the year of the elephant. Right? So the year of the elephant is kind of like a signature point in history. All right. So this is about the age of Khadija radiallahu anha. Was she never married before? No, actually she was married before twice. So Muhammad bin Jarir al-Tabari quotes that تزوج أبو هالة خديجة ابن خويلد فولدت له هندا وهالة رجلين فمات هالة وأدرك هند الإسلام فأسلم. So Khadija was actually married to a man named Abu Hala prior to the Prophet ﷺ, and she gave birth to 2 men, Hala and Hind. Both today are perceived as feminine names, but actually at the time they weren't. They were considered normal names. They're names that can be given to a boy or a girl, Hind and Hala. Like there's some names that are like that today, like Islam is one of those names, can be given to a boy or a girl. Iman can be given to a boy or a girl, right? So there's certain names like that today even that are like that. Not very common now, but it's how it was. So they were both men, and that's why he actually describes, he says, kana rajulain, like, just to that, for emphasis, right? And one of them died and before Islam, but one of them actually lived and became a Muslim, right? فأسلم, converted to Islam, and that is Hind. And we have Hind as a narrator of a hadith, a very famous hadith. This is hadith number 4 in Ash-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyah, the book written by Imam al-Tirmidhi, which describes the Prophet ﷺ. This is a book that describes the Prophet ﷺ. Hadith number 4 in that collection is actually quoted by Hind ibn Abi Hala. Right? So Hind ibn Abi Hala is basically, he was raised in the household of the Prophet ﷺ. And Al-Hasan ibn Ali, right, the son of Ali, this is the grandson of the Prophet ﷺ. Ali was married to Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet. They were blessed with Al-Hasan and Al-Hussein. And so Al-Hasan is the older of the 2 siblings, and he was 5 when the Prophet passed away. So he doesn't remember the features of the Prophet. So he says, I asked my maternal uncle, Khali, right? Who is his Khal? Who's his uncle? The brother of his mom, Fatima. It is Hind. Brother from the same mother, but not the same father, right? So he asked them, and he's described as wassaf, wakana wassafan, meaning he was able to like describe things, right? He asked them an hilyati Rasulillah, the adornment of the Messenger alayhi salatu wasalam. And why is he asking this? Al-Hasan says, وَأَنَا أَشْتَهِي أَنْ يَصِفَ لِي مِنْهَا شَيْئًا أَتَعَلَّقُ بِهِ. And I wish that he would describe to me something that I could hold on to. Like he was hoping that his uncle can describe the Prophet to him, something that he can hold on to and remember, right? So this is hadith, by the way, is a very long hadith that describes the Prophet. I encourage you to check it out. It is in Ash-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyya by At-Tirmidhi. I just wanted to highlight like Hind ibn Abi Hala, he embraced Islam and lived long enough, and he passed away like after the Prophet by many years. And here is another person that is interestingly sometimes confused to being one of the children of Khadija. His name is Al-Harith. And so here, Al-Baladhuri, he is a genealogist, so he kind of, traces the lineages of people. He says, أَمَّا الْحَارِث فَهُوَ رَبِيبُ خَدِيجَةَ. He's the foster son of Khadija, right? رضي الله عنها. وَلَيْسَ ابْنًا لَهَا. He was not her son. بَلْ هُوَ ابْنٌ لِزَوْجِهَا أَبِي هَالَ. So Abi Hala, who was married to Khadija before the Prophet ﷺ, he had, from a previous marriage, he had a son named Al-Harith. Why am I mentioning Al-Harith? Because Al-Harith, later on, we will see him as the first shaheed of Islam. So he actually, the first shaheed of Islam is Al-Harith ibn Abi Hala, radiallahu anhu. And he was raised by Khadija and raised by the Prophet ﷺ. And then, خَلَفَ عَلَى خَدِيجَ بَعْدَ أَبِي Hala. So Abi Hala passes away, and Khadija now is a widow, but she gets married to a man named Atiq, right? And she gives birth to a girl named Hind. And Hind also embraces Islam. This is now a girl Hind, right? So there's a guy Hind and a girl Hind, right? So this is a woman Hind, she's a woman I should say. And then she marries later on a Sahabi named Sayfi ibn Umayyah, right? So she marries Sayfi ibn Umayyah. He was actually her cousin. فَوَلَدَتْ لَهُ Muhammad. So her child, she gave birth to a child and she named him after her foster father, right? Her stepfather, or foster father, right? Her stepfather is Muhammad alayhi salam, the Prophet. She named her son after her stepfather, Muhammad ibn Sayfi, right? So but that's all we know actually about Hind, bint Abi Hala, right? The daughter of Abi Hala. We don't know anything else about her. But she's one of the daughters of Khadija. So Khadija now is marrying the Prophet ﷺ. She is 40 years old. She's a businesswoman. She's wealthier than him. He's literally broke. She's his employer. He's her employee, right? He is non-married, never married, no children, young 25-year-old man. She has been married twice, widowed twice. Her husbands have passed away. And she has children. Not only children of her own, but children of one of her ex-husbands, one of her previous husbands, right? One of her previous husbands, she has one of his children as well that she's raising. So she's raising Al-Harith and she has her own children, right? Hind, Hala, and another Hind, right? So 4 children that she's raising, and she's entering into this marriage with the Prophet ﷺ. So how many taboos have we broken here, right? So many, right? But that's how the Prophet got married, ﷺ, right? And she proposed. There we go, another taboo that was broken as well, right? All right, we will conclude here, inshallah. And next time, if Allah permits, inshallah, we'll touch upon the marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Khadija. How did it grow? What were they blessed with? What trials did they go through? And that will be our next topic, inshallah. Very close to coming to the revelation. And you might wonder, maybe just a question that is posed, why are we talking so much about the Prophet ﷺ before revelation? And the reason really is because this is all in preparation to receiving the revelation, right? The Prophet says, alayhi salam, in hadith, although weak hadith, but he says, أَدَّبَنِي رَبِّي فَأَحْسَنَ تَأْدِيبِي. My Lord developed me and He perfected my development. And so the Prophet ﷺ is being developed, prepared for prophethood. Why did he receive revelation at the age of 40? Why not 30? Why not 25? It was because he was being prepared for the message, right? And so look at your own lives as such, that you're being prepared inshallah for something that is great. Look at how and why and what is it that you're going through as development, the stage of development that you're going through. And so he, alayhi salam, was being developed, and one of the things that really did a significant change in his life was his own marriage. And so this is the question that we leave you with, inshallah, to discuss. What would you look for in a spouse? And we'll leave you with that discussion, inshallah. Anything good I said is from Allah alone, any mistakes my own. Jazakumullah khair. Barakallahu feekum. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.